Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the forum at Grace Cathedral on this change of time. We're glad of the extra hour. Also, I want to acknowledge that this is Guy Fawkes Day, much more important than Halloween, and really ought to be made into an opera. My name's Alan Jones. I'm the Dean Emeritus of Grace Cathedral and a very proud founder of the Forum program way back in 1995. And I'm particularly delighted to be moderating this forum, as the opera is a very important thing in my life. Also, the art scene in the Bay Area seems to be in a period of great upheaval. The artistic directors of the Berkeley Rep and ACT, American Conservatory Theatre, have both announced that they're leaving their companies. You no doubt read this week that Michael Tilson Thomas announced his departure date from the symphony this week. And on the national level, we may be on the way to losing entirely 3 venerable government institutions whose collective mission is to ensure universal access to excellent art and culture. And so we're in a kind of fix in many ways. Our guest today, now in his second year as General Director of the San Francisco Opera, has been with the organization for 12 years, focusing especially on new projects and initiatives and engagement with the community, and he's particularly well placed to help us navigate the state of the arts, both locally and nationally. He has a remarkable curriculum vitae. It reads like a kind of distinguished obituary, if you're not careful. So we'll get to sort of his actual sort of achievements soon. But please join me in welcoming Matthew Shilvock to the forum. So thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you for joining us this morning. I had to ask Matthew about his last name, his surname, Shilvock. I assumed it was Polish or some kind of immigrant thing, and I find that it's just from an English village, which is sort of disappointing, because I was hoping that he'd have this weird kind of Eastern European background with musical people floating about. So tell us the story of how you're born in England, you read music, you study, and then you end up in San Francisco. Can you just give us a sort of an itinerary of how you got to be where you are now?
The westward migration.
The westward migration, yeah.
Well, first of all, it's a great privilege to be here and to be part of Forum, Alan, and this is just such a great series, and it was a great honor to be invited, so thank you. So the name Shilvock comes from, as Alan said, just a little hamlet. I think it's basically a farm, to be honest, in Shropshire called Shilvock, and which I think is just Anglo-Saxon for shelf of oak. So you can't get more boring than that as a name derivation. And it's the name Shilvock is concentrated in the West Midlands in the UK, and a couple of us have fled the coop, as it were. Right. So I knew that I wanted to get into opera from a pretty early age. I saw my first opera at 12.
What was it?
It was an interesting piece. It was a contemporary opera done in the Central Television Studios in Birmingham. And it was done by the director Graham Vick, who, if any of you are opera subscribers, you may remember his Tannhäuser and his Lucia with Nathalie Dessay from a few years ago. And he is this incredibly thoughtful, provocative, open director who really looks to bring opera into communities. And although he works across the world in all of the great houses, he has maintained this company in Birmingham, which brings opera into the community. They use community choruses, community supers, and this was a contemporary version of Beauty and the Beast, and you followed the action around through the studios. It was very
you were
immersive.
11, you said?
12, I think.
12, yeah.
So it was a great example of how active opera can be as an art form. It's not something you receive passively, it's something you take part in. So that was my impetus, and I think by the time I was at Oxford, I just knew that I wanted to work in opera administration. I think it was...
Not singing?
Not singing, definitely not singing. But I think it was that masochistic desire for the complexity of this huge jigsaw puzzle of all the arts coming together. And I tried desperately to get into British opera companies, and very, very nice informational interviews, but no jobs ever open. Because at that point, there was only about 5 companies in the UK, professional companies, and people stayed in those jobs for life. And so it was very slow moving. So I came out to the States, and I'd heard about this fellowship program with Opera America, our trade organization. And I tried to get into that, and they said, no, we can't accept foreign applications. We can't provide a visa. So I came out in the end and did a master's program in public administration, took a bit of a detour. And because of that, was able to get a visa and got onto the Opera America program. And they said at the beginning of that, where would you like to go? And of course, I said, I need to go to the Met. And I after we negotiated through that, and I ended up saying, I'll go anywhere but Texas. So they sent me to Houston.
You went to Houston?
And I loved it. It was a wonderful experience, and ended up working with David
Gockley. Right.
And then when he came out here to run San Francisco, he very kindly brought me with him.
And you'd had by that time experience on all sorts of levels of the opera, sort of administration and music and a repertoire and
exactly.
All that sort of
And David has been so generous with me. I mean, he's basically my only ever boss in the opera business. And so he would just keep adding new departments, new opportunities, new projects. And so it was a wonderful immersion into this company. And so a great privilege then to be able to take on his work and continue that.
Is it unusual for hiring someone from within, or is this sort of...
It's pretty unusual now. It used to be very much more the case. In Chicago, for example, there was very, very stable succession for many years. Here, Kurt Adler had used to be the chorus director and then morphed into the general directorship. But now it's very common for companies to look for a new shiny artistic object and a new shiny artistic vision. The challenge here, though, is you're programming 4 to 5 years out.
Yes.
I would say it takes about 3 years to figure out a company's complexity like San Francisco Opera. And so someone coming into this company thinks that they have just been given the keys to this great Ferrari that can do anything, and it can do anything. It takes a while to figure out the price of gas. So
and how it works out, and
exactly.
how much of it's a business, how much it's a vocation, how much
exactly.
is artistic integrity. So I don't know how to put this politely. My notes say, what the hell are you doing? But let's put it in a nicer way. What on earth, then, do you think you're up to? I mean, opera company, elitism, wealthy San Franciscans, a repertoire that's sort of all over the map. I mean, what is it about? I mean, I think it's important, and I think the opera is a tremendous... as I said to you, Auden's definition of life is a very grand opera played by a 10th-rate touring company. It's true. It's about, our own lives are operatic in some ways, and how we interpret our lives, and needing these great stories and visions. So I'm an enthusiastic supporter of the opera, but I wonder what keeps you going and what makes you tick in terms of keeping it in, because you have to be a manager, you have to know something about music, you have to be a bit of a psychiatrist. I mean, and then you've got to worry about people complaining about parking. I mean, when you think of the agenda that you have as the general director, it's enormous.
The crux of it, I think, comes down to that relationship between opera and life, art and life. And I may be a little biased in this, but to me, the operatic art form expresses that connection in a way that almost no other art form can, to that depth. You're taking this medium of song, which immediately puts it into a connective place with all of us, because most of us are blessed with a voice. And although we don't go around generally singing operatically in our day-to-day lives, we use that voice to express emotion. So when you're seeing opera on the main stage, you're just seeing this at an Olympic level almost, of this archetypal outpouring of what life means. And so to me, it's this just thrilling possibility to be able to take this art form, to continue to share it with audiences, with communities, and to be able to give people a place where they can come and have these moments of great catharsis. And I've kind of joked with our marketing department that I think our tagline should be, "We make you cry." Because if you think about it, where else in life, maybe other than funerals, do you go and in a collective group of thousands of people have the freedom to actually be able to sit there and just let your feelings out in such a profound way?
I think great art helps us negotiate our craziness.
It does.
In terms of putting it in context and sort of placing it in a much larger world. There was a character in San Francisco years ago who was often quoted in Herb Caen called Tom Youngblood, and when he died, he'd left instructions that I was to preach on the subject of the separation of church and opera. And I preached on there's no separation at all. And I agree with you, my first experience was a concert performance at the Proms of Madame Butterfly. But the first opera I went to was at Covent Garden, 1957, and it was The Trojans.
Wow.
With John Vickers and John Gielgud directing, and I was absolutely transported and blown away by this full opera, and the two things together. And so I understand that.
There was a moment at the end of Traviata, which we just did, and my box is right there, almost over the stage, and I got to sit there on opening night, and I was looking straight at the Violetta. And for those of you who know Traviata, there's this moment at the end where she's dying, and she thinks that she's regaining her strength. Her lover, Alfredo, has just returned, and she thinks everything is lifting. I feel better. There's a huge surge of hope. And we had an amazing singer doing it, Aurelia Florian. And just to see in that moment of extreme hope and then going to nothing. And I will remember that moment for as long as I live, because there was so much about life in that just instant of opera activity, which nothing else could ever have taught you. And the other experience I had in the summer was I was hosting a family, and I took them backstage to see part of Rigoletto, and we watched it from the wings. And I was watching these young boys, about 10-year-old, 8-year-olds, watching, just transfixed on what was going on the stage. And of course, backstage, there's no super titles, so they didn't have the specifics of what was happening. But it just struck me what an incredible teaching tool is for life. You can, with even young children, they're learning about grief, about jealousy, I mean, complex human emotions. And they're just there in a very, very immediate way in opera.
What's then the challenge of how to make opera accessible to people who normally couldn't afford it or go to it, or school children and so on? The opera does have programs around that.
We do. I mean, the flagship of that is our simulcasts out at the ballpark, where we have up to 30,000 people each year come and see it for free out at AT&T Park in a live transmission from the Opera House. And people don't leave. They sit there glued to the screen, and they can get up. They could go and get beer and garlic fries, but they don't. They're so focused on that opera. And to me, that's the one thing which always says year after year that opera has huge relevancy still. If there's challenges about connecting it, it's the delivery mechanism of this rather imposing opera house.
And the expense.
And the expense. But yes, there are expensive opera tickets, but there are also $25 opera tickets.
Well, and when people accuse us of being elitist, I say, do you know how much it costs to go to a ball game?
Right. And I've thought a lot about that, because people say, well, why do people pay to go to ball games? Why do they pay to go to Broadway shows? And to me, it's all about comfort level. Right. If you go to a ball game, you may not know what the outcome's going to be, but you know what the experience is going to be. If we're saying come to Janacek's Yennefer, there's just this big question mark for most people, and what on earth is that, which makes it a very expensive experiment. So I think our big job at the moment is to find ways to connect people to these operas without making people feel uncomfortable with the titles, with the singers' names. How do we get to that end point, to that little moment where you are in tears at the end and say, this is the experience you'll have at the opera?
And realizing balance, if you're working on a repertoire, how many performances of La Bohème do you have to have in order to have one performance of Moses and Aaron or some other kind of opera that way.
It's true, and we are one of the few companies in the world, and it should be a great point of pride, I think, for this city and the Bay Area, that we are one of those few companies that can do any single piece in the repertoire.
Yeah.
We were talking about the Messiaen Saint-François earlier.
Yeah.
There's almost no company that could pull that off, and we did it back in 2002 now, but to incredible acclaim. And so, actually, that makes it a little hard when you're programming seasons, because there are really no limitations. Some companies will have to be limited by what their artistic forces can do. We can do anything. So
it's getting people willing to work. That Messiaen, the Saint-François, I went because Donald Runnicles was conducting, and I went to a lot of rehearsals and listened to it over and over again. It was really hard work. And then something breaks through and your ear gets trained. And it's sort of getting people willing to try something.
Right.
So, I remember years ago, Poulenc was, and I went to the Dialogue of the Carmelites several times, and that's one of my favorite operas, but it took a long time for my ear to get used to that.
To language.
Being willing to work on it.
Well, we have to be so careful. I think one of the lessons that I've learned in the last years is it's very hard to watch an opera through original eyes, if you will, for someone who's in the business and trying to sell that opera, because this I think came home to me particularly with the Carmen we did 2 years ago, which was a rather contemporary production of Carmen, and it was divisive for the audience. Some people loved it, some people hated it. And
I liked it musically. But I didn't like the set.
The worst thing, I think, is for me, the sign of the greatest feeling that we've done something wrong is if someone comes out and says, "Well, I enjoyed it if I close my eyes." Yeah. That's to me, that says we've done something very wrong. But so that Carmen, we had all gone through that Carmen. We'd known what it was about beforehand, before it was on stage. The director comes in, they give you this wonderful spiel about the intent of the piece and why they've picked certain things. Then you spend 4 weeks in rehearsal, watching the whole thing coming together, understanding why that Christmas tree's on the car, driving around on stage. You understand all of that nuance, and so you begin to feel very comfortable with it. Someone coming in for the first time has none of that.
Had the training.
So I keep trying to put myself back in that original position, because it's most of our audience don't have the luxury of seeing it multiple times. So.
Yeah. In terms of the biggest challenges you have, there's 2 operas coming. There's one, The Girls of the Golden West, sounds an amazing thing, and then something I saw at Santa Fe that is coming, the one about Steve Jobs. Can you talk a bit about those 2 and what we might expect with The Girls of the Golden West with those 2 remarkable people, John Adams and Peter Sellers? Yeah.
Well, these are 2 new operas that we're doing. The Girls of the Golden West, although the title may be familiar to you from the Puccini opera, this is a brand new opera by John Adams, a Berkeley-based composer, but really one of the great titans of our world at the moment in the music business. And then the other one is The Revolution of Steve Jobs, which we're a co-commissioner of, but which Santa Fe originated this summer, which will come here in 2020. So don't get too excited too quickly. So The Girls of the Golden West. Before I go into each one, what I love about both of these is that they are telling our story, the story of Northern California, of the Bay Area. These are pieces that have such local resonance that we can enjoy them in a particular way in this community, and understand our own community through these pieces, even though one is historical and one is about a man who lived a very life separated from what most of us can imagine. But in both of them, they're telling our story of modern day San Francisco, basically, or Bay Area. What I then love about San Francisco and the Bay Area is that anything that happens here is pretty much globally iconic. So it's this wonderful realization that you can tell a story that is very localized to the Bay Area, but because of the iconic nature of where we live, people around the world can understand it as well. So Girls of the Golden West is, I'll give the elevator pitch for it.
Yes.
It is an attempt to tell the real story of the gold rush, the gold rush happening just 200 miles northeast of here, up in the towns of Downeyville and Rich Bar, or the mining communities of Downeyville and Rich Bar, mainly through the eyes of an incredible woman by the name of Louise Clapp, who went under the pen name of Dame Shirley, and she wrote these 23 exquisite letters back to her sister in Massachusetts. She came out with her husband, who was a doctor, in 1851 and 1852. They spent about 18 months up in the camps. And she writes back to her sister with this amazing poetic detail about what was happening, both in terms of what life was like, what people were wearing, how they lived, what their cabins looked like, but also a lot of the racial tensions that were happening and the melting pot of humanity that was happening in this very small area up in the Sierra. And this becomes the basis, her commentary becomes the basis in her own words for the opera. And so she is the protagonist of the story, but she's joined by these 6 other amazing characters that represent a very diverse and an incredibly rich variety of life that was happening up there. And for me, it was transformative in my limited and rudimentary understanding of the gold rush, to understand how incredibly expansive a time that was, but also how incredibly challenging a time it was. And when John Adams and Peter Sellers conceived of this piece, this was about 3.5, 4 years ago. So everything that, well, a lot of what's happening in the world now politically, the rise of nationalism and so forth was not really on the radar in the same way that it is now. So the piece wasn't written to reflect the current time, but it has become this amazing mirror to what we're going through. There's a chorus of minors in Act 2 as the tension begins to ratchet up, and this group of miners is marching across the stage, singing these kind of nationalistic chants, which are really just miners' songs, but they've been appropriated into a darker place. And we began rehearsing that scene on the night of Charlottesville.
Wow.
And it was such a powerful moment for the whole company, just to feel that connection of time and place. And so the Girls of the Golden West is far from just a history lesson about the real gold rush. It's a lesson about...
And it's got the race issue built in.
The race issue is very powerfully dealt with in Act 2. And there's a moment where one of the characters, whose name is Ned Peters, he's a freed slave and becomes one of the black cowboys of the West, whose story is told throughout the opera in a very engaging way, not just in a sense of racial tension, but we see him in a very fun light in Act 1, and then in Act 2, as this tension mounts, he takes to the stage, and we have this huge tree stump on stage, which is the second act set, and he delivers this oration. The second act is set on July 4th, the first American July 4th in California. And he delivers this oration using text by Frederick Douglass, the great freed slave abolitionist, on what is the 4th of July to a slave. And I was mentioning to Alan earlier, we did this aria in a couple of events earlier this week in a small-scale setting, and at the end of it, tears were just pouring down people's faces. It was there's a huge amount of depth and humanity in this piece, so I'm excited for that. And then the Steve Jobs opera coming up a few years hence. Again, it uses an iconic narrative, in this case, the story of Steve Jobs. But what appealed to me about it, and why I thought it was important that we do it in San Francisco, is that it tells a much broader story. It tells a story of the frenzy, the rush of energy of life of this part of the world at the moment, and the struggle between work and life, between what sense of what is accomplishment at the end of one's life, standing back and saying, did that really matter? Yeah. And I found that piece so powerful when Santa Fe did it, and the audience reaction was so strong. It's a very immediately accessible piece.
It is.
Mason Bates knows how to write for the voice in that place where the voice touches you, the audience. And that's actually a pretty rare thing at the moment. There's, again, the voice in opera should be used to connect to your inner soul, and it takes a certain composer to know how to do that. Yeah. So some exciting Bay Area operas coming up.
I'm looking forward to the Girls of the Golden West, which is soon.
Opens November 21.
Opens this month.
Much to the chagrin of the world critics, the American national critics. We put it 2 days before Thanksgiving, the opening. So
perfect.
They are very kindly accommodating our scheduling there.
Yeah. And the Steve Jobs I saw twice in Santa Fe this summer, and I was very taken by it. It was very fine. So this is the first season of the opera that you planned.
Actually, no, I'm still in legacy from David.
Oh, really? So this is
This will be his final season of planning. So again, we plan typically 4 to 5 years out. And so this season is still David Gockler's programming, which we then execute. But having been here for so long with David, I was a big part of the logistics of putting the calendar together and so forth. So, and it's a great season. It's a season.
What is it that you love about this particular?
I love the depth of variety in it. If for those of you who are seeing the fall unfold, we have 5 operas, and each of them is such a different world on stage. And to me, if our season can be a series of, essentially this is make believe at the highest level of excellence. If we can take you and from night to night put you in different worlds and make you feel like you're part of those worlds, we've done a great job. And this fall season, there's such variety, visually, aesthetically, musically. So, and then of course the Ring at the end.
Right.
So the Ring cycle in June of next year, back with Donald as well.
Donald's conducting.
And no greater exploration of humanity than that 16-hour epic.
Yes, deep breath. Yes, yes. Now, I want to go back to the Santa Fe and jobs and the new operas. This past spring, you announced this initiative in collaboration with a number of other opera companies, Opera for All Voices, Stories for Our Time, and the first project debuts in 2019 in Santa Fe, I think. Is it just a device to save money?
No, we're spending money.
Oh, you're spending money. Okay, good. I mean, I wondered, doing
No.
joint productions, how does that work?
Well,
and why?
In general, you always want to be doing joint projects, and I think for a couple of reasons. And I'll come back to the Opera for All Voices in a second. But even in terms of a production on stage of, a new production of Marriage of Figaro or something like that, or a new piece like the Steve Jobs piece, it's a very expensive art form to create. And so if you can be in a situation where you're defraying those costs amongst other companies, then, that has an immediate benefit for everybody. But beyond the pure number side of it, it also gives these pieces a legitimacy and a continued pathway. There's a great energy behind the world premiere at the moment, and every company wants to be doing world premieres, which is tremendous in one way, because now there's this huge outpouring of new work happening, particularly in American opera. The challenge is nobody wants to do the piece for the second time. And so the notion of building a canon of new 21st century opera is actually very hard. And so if you can get relationships built where there's a commitment to these pieces continuing, and the Girls of the Golden West, for example, will go to Amsterdam and then to Dallas. So at least we know it's for the next 3 or 4 years.
It's got a life.
It's got a currency.
Yeah.
So there's nothing more depressing to me than to put all of this work into a new production or even a new opera and doing 6 performances and then that's it. And it's never seen again.
Never seen again, yeah.
And also, pieces take a while to really develop. I mean, we did Moby Dick, Jake Hager's Moby Dick. We were the 5th company in the consortium. By the time it got here, I don't think our audiences felt any sense of being deprived of the world premiere. Rather, they had a piece that Jake had even more finely crafted over those 5 productions. So, Broadway has this down much better than opera does in terms of longer shelf life and longer legitimacy for pieces. But if we can find those consortiums, so much the better. And so what we're trying to do with the Opera for All Voices is apply that to children's opera or family opera, and trying to build a better repertoire of family pieces by having, in this case, a consortium of about 7 companies come together and really invest in family programming. And the interesting twist we're putting on it is the first couple will be by well-established composers. And then as part of the project, those composers and librettists will then mentor, in a more competition-based sense, new composers and librettists, with the notion, hopefully, that we can really help build the repertoire of great family operas.
Is there anything in the old repertoire that you haven't done, that you're saying, oh, I'd love to do?
Well, I've mentioned this before. Everybody, of course, wants to know when I got into this job, what are you going to program?
Yes.
And the one thing I have talked about is the music of Rameau, French Baroque composer, successor to Lully. Lully was writing under the Sun King Louis XIV, and then Rameau picked up the baton of French Baroque, and incredibly powerful music, just rhythmically very decisive. He wrote Platé.
Yeah.
And so we've never done any Rameau. And the great thing about Baroque opera, and for those of you who may have seen Parthenope recently, for example, or Xerxes, or some of the other Baroque pieces we've done across the years, you can be much more playful with those because there's no expectation. Almost nobody has ever seen these pieces before. There's no sense of the tradition of this like there is with a piece like Tosca. So you can really go on these very interesting creative journeys with them, and audiences are generally very excited to do so. So we'll see, knock wood, that we can make a little Rameau work in the Opera House.
Yeah, I think the hard thing, if one has gone to the opera a lot and say seen lots of productions of Tosca, you get very critical, overcritical. I do, of the director, not so much musically, but the director wants to do something different, and often the director gets in the way. I mean,
that's the problem.
I remember seeing a Traviata. I think it was in Toronto, where all the women were bald. Do you remember that? I mean, they were in regular sort of 19th century dresses, but every woman was bald. And I thought, okay.
Well, the problem is, if too much of that is happening, then your ability to put yourself into that story is now diminished because you're spending so long trying to figure out what you're putting yourself into the middle of.
Yes.
And to me, a great opera director invites you into the story.
Right.
And that's why you're feeling this immense emotion in it, because you're feeling like it's your life being told on stage. And I've kind of joked that opera is so successful because its plots are pretty bad. Because if this was all tight drama, if this was kind of a Hitchcockian film, then there'd be no place for you to go into it. You admire it from a distance. But because opera has this kind of latitude in the narrative, it almost invites you into it. So you can say, that is my life on stage, even though I don't know anyone who died of consumption. I know of, or I experienced love lost too young. So it has a flexibility to it. So I will say, we opened Manon last night, Massenet opera. And it's a very abstracted set, somewhat a blend of contemporary and traditional costumes. But it tells the story in an incredibly connected way. So again, you're not trying to battle with the storytelling on stage to try and figure out why this is happening or why that's happening. You're invited into the storytelling, and it moves along with such a wonderful pace, and you feel very romantically connected to these characters. So it definitely can be done in a contemporary setting, but you need a director who's willing to invite the audience in and not try and create something that the audience has to interpret.
Yeah, Tom Stoppard says that all great art withholds information, and then you have to work and enter into the program. I have so many contradictory feelings. One of the things I miss is that people don't dress well for the opera anymore.
You know who does?
Who does?
High school children.
High school children.
We often have high schoolers come in, or even middle schoolers, to the dress rehearsals. They are dressed to the nines. It's wonderful.
They're all dressed up.
They are. They feel this great sense of presence.
I mean, I'm sounding elitist but you lose a sort of sense of occasion.
We walk this very fine line, I think, in the opera, because we want it to be accessible, we want it to be open, we don't want there to be any barriers to anybody to come to the opera. But we also want it to be a special experience, because especially in this building, in the Opera House here, for those of you who know it, it's this beautifully gilded palace and kind of temple to art in a way, which almost doesn't exist anywhere quite like it in the US. And so when you walk into that building, you do feel this great sense of occasion, and you do feel like it's a special place to be. And so we don't want to diminish that sense, but we also don't want to have barriers. So it's a very fine line, and yes, people do come dressed in everything now, and we certainly welcome that. and the Met actually has a very nice blog they do called I think it's Last Night at the Met, and they have a photographer who takes photos of people at the Met, and oftentimes it's people in very designer jeans and things, but it gives that sense that this is a place where you can dress up and have a special experience.
Yeah. Yes. The other thing I want to bring up before we open it up to the audience, if you please write your questions down, is what's happening nationally. I'm not talking about politically, or at least I am about the arts, but in the 2018 US budget, just approved narrowly by the Senate and now moving to the House, would entirely eliminate the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The NEA has been a long-time supporter of the San Francisco Opera, particularly of this new work, evidently, a little for the Girls of the Golden West. Why are the arts worth government support? I mean, you think of Europe, particularly Germany, and places where every great city has has an opera house and is supported. I don't know how much now, but how do you negotiate this relationship with the government?
It's a fascinating topic, and actually when I did my public policy degree, I tried to skew it as much as possible to arts policy because it is so fascinating. And Alan, you probably feel this as I do. It's somewhat confusing in terms of the challenge of connecting the arts to government in the US, and it's not just about funding. I mean, one can make a relatively decent claim that in a kind of passive way, the U.S. government is supporting the arts at a much higher level through the tax deduction, as it is with any charity area. But that kind of misses the point, because what government support can do for the arts is basically say the arts are critical to us as a civilization, and without an expression of that at the highest levels, it can be very challenging for us as companies to then try and make that message clearly felt. I had a great experience a few weeks ago. I got to go and see what the Warriors were doing for their new stadium, and got to see all of the beautiful computer modeling and so forth they'd done. And you see this architecturally designed building sitting there just below AT&T Park. There's a beautiful park they're building along the waterway there. There's shops and restaurants and public transit. And I just had this moment of thinking, if this was a European city, that would be an opera house. Because, and you see that particularly in some of the Scandinavian recent buildings, there is a sense of community, of place, of cultural importance for the arts. And I think it's incredible that in a city like this, a relatively small city, that the arts do have the prominence they do. But I think we are, without that level of the national dialogue, including the culture as an important part of just life and the expression of life, it can be more challenging to make that on the local level more acutely felt. So the NEA has been the subject of controversy for decades. I mean, the 1980s almost saw the closure of the NEA with when they were funding works by controversial visual works by people like Andreas Serrano. And it's always been this just ignition point for really a broader political ideological debate, whereas in Europe, particularly Germany, where the companies there are still about 80% funded by the government. It's almost a badge of honor to have those kind of those politically inflammatory productions on stage. So it's a very different model here. I dearly hope that these institutions, which are very modest, I mean, the NEA's total budget is about $150 million, which is a rounding error to most government departments at the federal level. But in having that expression, even at that level, is so important. The NEA funding of Girls of the Golden West puts a mark and a very important imprimatur of that this is important to society. This is an important thing that can stand tall in our world. So for the minuscule amount of money that is spent on these three agencies, I dearly hope that they are protected and that common sense will prevail.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. I'm thinking of the upheaval in various arts organizations in San Francisco. And there's a sort of a serious undertone of what I want to say is that Tony Taccone is leaving the Berkeley Rep. He led it for 22 years. Carrie Perloff and Michael Torson Thomas for 25 years. So, as the 7th general director in 93 years of history in San Francisco Opera, where do you see yourself in 2041?
A sanatorium.
Sanatorium.
What was the year again? 2041?
2041, yeah.
Well, we've almost programmed out to that point. No, not quite. We are programming 22, 23 at the moment, though, so
Okay.
It's amazing how far into the future we go in this business. I hope that whether it's here or somewhere else, and I hope I'm permitted to stay here long enough to really make an impact. But I hope that I'm in a place that really celebrates that crux of connection between opera and community.
Okay. You don't have sort of some deep longing to return to the UK, or that you're at home in America?
After ending up in Houston, Texas, from a beginning in a little English village in Worcestershire, I've given up trying to predict what comes next.
Yes, right,
so,
yes.
so wherever it is, whether it's the UK, the US, or somewhere else, I just hope that it's in a place where we actually build the connection of opera and community, or the arts and community, and that there's a sense of pride for what is happening. Yeah. And again, I think that's a somewhat tectonic shift that has to happen, because even 5-10 years ago, just saying what you were doing was enough to get people to come and pay attention. There was enough people who recognized words like Falstaff or Brynterfel or Patricia Rosset, who understood the lexicon of what we do, and who then would pick and choose what they would see. That's changed now to a point where those words outside of our full subscription series have very little resonance. But again, you go back to the ballpark and you see what the impact is we have.
That's what I find. It's not that people are stupid. They're not. I mean, I find it hard when I go around the country occasionally lecturing that I cannot assume that people know the plot of Hamlet, so that I can't make a Shakespearean reference very easily without explaining it. And it's not, and I don't mean to insult people. I mean, people aren't stupid. It's just that they haven't read some of the things that I'd hoped they'd would have read. And
but I actually think there's an excitement in that, again, for us the charge is now to say, how do we create a more fundamental bond between communities and what we're doing that isn't title specific, that isn't singer specific, that basically says, we as a community understand that a company like San Francisco Opera will give us an amazing experience if we walk through those doors. Yeah. And it doesn't matter what the title is, we're going to take a chance on it. We trust that the company will do that. So if we can crack that, if we can build that fundamental connection, I think we have a chance of really having a very exciting future. So I'll check back in with you in a...
Check back. I'm going to open it up to the audience, but at the risk of being elitist, I remember giving a lecture years ago on what aesthetic meant. And aisthanesthai, the Greek verb, means to perceive something in such a way that you're willing to be changed by what you see. That was a sort of full freight of the meaning, and I wanted to sort of conclude our time together with just the last three lines, or the last line of Rilke's poem about the archaic torso of Apollo, when you're looking at a work of art and it looks back at you, and you have to change. You're not criticizing it, it's sort of critiquing you. And he said, for here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. And that's what I think great art does, whether it's poetic or dramatic art, and the opera certainly engages me, even when I'm angry at a production. We saw Don Giovanni in La Fenice, where Don, after he's gone down to hell, he comes back and kills everybody.
In the epilogue?
Yeah, he kills everybody. It was so bad.
But you're still talking about it.
But I'm still talking about it. So my point too, as I'm on the board of ACT, I don't have to like what they're doing, but I support it 100% because, you know, the next thing I will, you know, and it's part of an ongoing conversation. And to see just because something you don't like doesn't mean that you don't support the idea or the thing behind it.
Right.
And that's what I try and get across.
And hopefully as arts companies, we're creating a space where people feel comfortable to have that kind of dialogue. I will say the thing that I love about a great production, and I don't know if you felt this being in the Opera House or another venue, is there's a feedback loop that begins to happen between the stage and the audience.
Yes. Yeah.
And if the audience is getting it, if people are feeling it emotionally, the singers then feel that energy and start giving more. The audience feels it even more, and it's this wonderful feedback loop that builds and builds. And it doesn't happen every night by any means, but when it happens collectively in that theater, and I think it did for Trojans a couple of years ago certainly, and something since, you just feel the collective power of art as well. And
it's the same with preaching, actually.
Really? You feel that connectivity?
If a preacher, I don't always do it, but I know when to shut up. Because there's this kind of out there. And you know when you're engaged too. So it's a really a mutual exercise of mutual cooperation and very so valuable. We've got some wonderful questions. How have the major challenges to American opera houses changed over the course of your career? Was funding or making opera accessible a long-standing issue? What's your top goal in your role? It's a lot of questions there, but the challenges of opera houses over the course of your career, and sort of what is the dominant goal you feel you might have right now?
I think the opera is the most flawed economic model you could ever imagine, and has always been so and will always be so. And every generation of opera has had to figure out how to deal with this fundamental funding nut, whether it's King Ludwig II of Bavaria just pouring tons of his own money into it, or what we're trying to do now, which is build very robust funding sources from many people. So that is always a challenge of opera. But I think the fundamental challenge now comes back to that issue of how do you build the connection point in the absence of those familiar words which are no longer familiar, like those titles and those singers. So to me, that's the big challenge for us, is how do we inspire people to come into the opera house? I think for much of the last century at least, there was a certain predetermined connection between audiences and art, and you could expect a certain audience to show up just because you were who you were in the city. We now have to earn that in a much more active way, and we can't expect audiences just to be there because we're the San Francisco Opera. We have to inspire people to come, and so I think that doesn't necessarily change what happens on stage, but it changes how we talk about what happens on stage. So I think that's the big thing, and I think my fundamental goal I would articulate in a similar vein to that, which is I would like us to be an organization that's trusted by the city. Whether or not you attend the opera, whether or not you ever set foot into that building, that you have this feeling of pride in this community, that it has a company of that caliber, and you feel a sense of this is part of San Francisco.
Yeah. I think that you raise a deeply important matter about institutions as such, about do we trust. There's a sort of absence of trust, and therefore an absence of culture, not culture with a big C, but just ordinary culture where we could have common ground to have a good row with each other, a good argument, a good disagreement, and it's okay to do that. And that's a sad loss, I think. Good question here. Now in your second season, I believe David Gockley chose the program for this year. Did you work with him on choosing it? Now with him no longer general director, do you ask his advice? You better say yes, sir. Is it more difficult carrying out a program you did not initiate choosing? Or did you do it together, I suppose, is the question.
David is an incredible friend and mentor to me, and I do definitely. We still spend a lot of time together. He still lives up in Sausalito, and we see each other on a regular basis. And so we're always talking about what's happening. And I love, again, that sense of continuity in the in the programming, in the sense of what the company is. It's been a joy for me to enact these seasons,
great,
and you take the framework of the singers and the productions, and then there's still many things your singer pulls out. You've got to replace a singer. You're working on the finer points of how to then execute those new productions and so forth. So there's still plenty of input that we can have as a new administration into those, while still respecting the importance of the seasons that David planned. And then, getting very quickly, as soon as I was appointed, getting very quickly into the future seasons, because you can't get behind the curve. If you want the great singers, if you want the great productions, you've got to be thinking ahead. So that was the first thing, is to quickly get into programming new seasons.
And David, I think it's great that he was an apprentice at Santa Fe, and a singer. So he sort of from the ground up knows the craft.
Exactly, and that is so important, because it's in those fine details of execution that you rise or fall in this business, because just the little things like thinking through, how many choristers are in a show, and are you setting up two big chorus shows against each other? Can they rehearse at the same time? Right. How the things move on stage. There are so many elements to that, and so we have a great team at the opera, and the artistic, the production, the music, people all coming together, and we're trying to avert problems before we get them on stage.
There's a nice loaded question here. I love
good.
this. It says, will the Ring be staged in a modern form, or will you go back to how Wagner wanted it? Wanted it staged. I think that's a great question, actually, because that's a sort of summarizes the controversies about how you do opera, and from the tradition to how the innovation and so on. Yeah. And
Wagner was a great innovator. Wagner, he was a great egomaniacal, self-centered person as well. But he had such a vision for what his operas should be, to the point that he went and built his own opera house in Bayreuth, and started designing stage machinery for the Rhine maidens and so forth. He was so deeply immersed in the innovative potential of opera. And the interesting thing about Bayreuth is it is one of the most experimental places on the planet to see Wagner's music, and it's still run by his family. His great-granddaughter Katharina Wagner runs it, and it's stayed in the Wagner hands since Wagner built it in the 1870s. And it's one of the most challenging places to go and see Wagner, because they take it to places that, I would be run out of town if I put some of those productions on stage. So it's interesting, the notion of what Wagner and now Wagner's family wanted out of those pieces, because Bayreuth's one of the most sacred shrines where you can't do anything but Wagner, and it's got this great almost religiosity about it, in the cult of Wagner, but yet these productions go very extreme. I think that the production that we do, and if you saw it in 2011, it's the same production. There'll be some enhancements. It's grown, it's developed in the sense of dramaturgy, as any work of art does. But it's great storytelling, and there's a sense of some contemporary elements to it. It kind of goes through American history in a way. It actually begins in the California Gold Rush, interestingly, and works through into a more dystopian time for Gerda Dämmerung. But it is great storytelling that never gets in the way, in my mind, of Wagner's intent, Wagner's libretto, the relationships between the characters. And it has some wonderful Northern California touches as well. The rock that Brunhilde is put to sleep on at the end of Valkyrie, you may, if any of you have seen it, you may realize the connection to the armament positions up in the Marin Headlands, and that was the inspiration for that. Now, you don't need to know that to appreciate the stagecraft, but it weaves in these little elements from American culture, and Citizen Kane is another inspiration for the film, and so it finds these little ways to, again, be comfortable with us as audiences. So I know you certainly won't get breastplates and horns for the Valkyries, but there is a great respect for Wagner and his storytelling, and for me, that is what we should be looking for as productions. It matters less to me whether it's traditional or contemporary. It matters, does it connect us to the story.
Yeah, I come late to Wagner because I struggled with it. I made the mistake of I had for Christmas Cosima Wagner's diaries, and I kept them in the bathroom and read every day. And there was something to dislike about Wagner in every page. I mean, and she was praising him. You know, he was more distressed by the death of his dog than of his first wife. And
right.
things like that. And so it was a shame because it blotted out some of the music. So I started slowly, and you know, Meistersinger, and then The Ring, and so on. But it's there's a thing that is worth persevering not in a grim way, but I mean really working at it. Because there's a genius at work there that is quite amazing and quite contemporary, I think. You know.
And there's so much bound up in that that sense of who Wagner was as a man, and then the music he creates. And there's a great book by Father Owen Lee.
Yes, he's
on
very
that topic.
Good. He's terrific.
I think it's called something like Wagner, the terrible man and his incredible music. I'm paraphrasing, but it's a great book that lets you into that dichotomy of Wagner as a human being.
Yeah. There's a good question too that resonates for me about watching, say, Magic Flute in German or Magic Figaro in Italian. I've come to appreciate it in the original language with the supertitles or the subtitles. What do you think about, what's the difference, is the question, between Italian language opera and English language opera in your experience?
I think it can vary. There are certain things which work so well in the native tongue because they are written very idiomatically for particularly the vowel sounds of that language. And if you translate them into another tongue, then you can lose some of that connection of just the sound of the language. It's less about the intelligibility necessarily, because again, we can deal with that now. It's about the vocal sounds that are produced and why a composer would go to a particular note that sits well on a particular vowel. There are certain languages that express that more than others, and certain composers that express that more than others. I think in a big house like ours, and it can be challenging if you just had everything in English and no super titles. You probably would be in a worse place than you are now.
Their English is so bad.
Right, and
in some ways.
Well,
sometimes.
And by the time the sound gets blended up into the third 3,000 seats up in the house, I always felt this at the Colosseum in London with ENO, who do have a tradition of doing everything in English, and only in the last couple of years have added super titles, and it was actually quite hard to understand what was being sung. What we tend to do at San Francisco is, if there's a reason to be immediate in the vernacular, we will think strongly about that. And Magic Flute was a good example with all of that dialogue.
Too much
in German. It's just, you lose the jokes. There's Mozart would have laughed at us if he'd come into this English-speaking audience and seen his music being performed in German. He would have thought that was completely ridiculous, because that was an opera that was intended for the people. It was intended to have an immediacy to it. So I think we look at that particularly for the comic operas as an option. Right. But in order to make an opera like Manon understood, singing that in English wouldn't help. No.
We're going to have to stop, but I want to thank you for coming, and I wondered if there's any last word you'd like to give, because this is also recorded, and the audience here today. If there's anything you'd like them to take away from this conversation, except show up.
Show up is a good one, but come and experience what we're doing, and I think this is one of the most supportive communities for opera in the world, and that we can do what we do in this relatively small community and have these transformational moments on stage is just a credit to you all and how you support the arts in San Francisco. So I'm as challenging as it may be on so many levels logistically, I have a huge optimism for the future of this art form, because we are telling the stories of humanity, and those stories will never stop being relevant. And whether these are old works or new works, we're finding ways into the human soul and doing that collectively, and that to me is a pretty exciting proposition.
Well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I hope you'll come next week. There's a full Sunday next week with great music and the Royal British Legion. I mean, there's so many things going on next week. But please join me and with the Dean, Malcolm Young, next week when our guest will be Peter Coyote. You'll know him as an actor who narrates the Ken Burns movies about the Vietnam War and so on. He'll be talking about his, what we call his high wire act of threading a Christian needle with Buddhist thread. He's a very engaging person who can interpret the 60s. I particularly resonate with him because I hated the 60s, and other people loved it. And you know, that whole notion of romanticizing people who fried their brains always drove me crazy. And so whether you think it's a spiritual quest or the power of art, and maybe we'll get some tales from the summer of love. If you can believe that, you can believe anything. And you're always, of course, welcome to join us for the 11 o'clock service upstairs. I want to remind you that we rely on your support for the forum, so please make a gift of whatever you can afford before leaving today. And again, thank you, Matthew Shilvock from England.
Not Poland.
Not Poland, for joining us this morning, and we look forward to seeing you next week at the forum. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Alan.
You were terrific. That was terrific.
Thank you.